The road to Whitmore was never meant to be found twice. It peeled away from the State Highway 23 miles south of Asheville, a narrow tongue of crumbling asphalt that licked its way through thickets of rhododendron and ancient hemlock. By the time the pavement dissolved into packed gravel and then into mud, most travelers would have turned back, convinced their GPS had led them astray. But Cole Danvers was not most travelers. He had spent 6 years chasing the cracks in the world, the stories that bled through the thin membrane of the ordinary, and the vanishing of an entire village was the kind of crack that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. He intended to be very careful. He pulled his battered Subaru to the side of the track and killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was immediate and absolute. No birdsong. No insect hum. Just the soft tick of cooling metal and the distant murmur of wind threading through pine needles like a rumor. Cole stepped out and felt the October chill seep through his jacket, carrying the scent of wet earth and something else, a faint, sweetly sour note that reminded him of old cellars, the kind where apples rotted into cider long after the cellar door had been sealed. He consulted the folded topographical map on the hood of the car. According to the hand-drawn correction a retired librarian had pressed into his palm in a diner outside Marion, Whitmore lay 3/4 of a mile ahead, cupped in a bowl-shaped valley that the logging companies had abandoned in the 1940s. He walked. The forest pressed in on either side, trunks furred with moss, their roots coiled over stones like arthritic fingers. After 10 minutes, the track opened into a clearing that wasn't a clearing at all, it was a main street, though the word street felt absurdly generous. A row of clapboard buildings sagged on either side, their paint faded to the color of bone. A single traffic light, unlit, swayed from a wire stretched between 2 wooden posts. Beneath it, a powder blue pickup truck sat with its driver's door open, the keys still dangling from the ignition, the vinyl seat bloated with moisture and speckled with black mold. Cole stood very still and listened to the emptiness. The silence here was deeper, layered, a physical weight that seemed to press against his eardrums like water at the bottom of a lake. He had read the police reports, the yellowed newspaper clippings, the official finding of mass disappearance, cause undetermined. He knew that on October 17, 1993, Deputy Harlan Creed had responded to a call from a worried postman and found Whitmore frozen in a moment of sudden absence. Breakfast plates on the tables of the Whitmore diner still held scrambled eggs and half-eaten toast, the eggs hardened into waxy yellow fossils. A television in the hardware store was still playing a morning talk show, its screen a flickering blue ghost until the generator finally died 3 days later. A child's sweater lay draped over a backpack on the steps of the schoolhouse, one arm pointing toward the open door as if the wearer had simply evaporated mid-step. No bodies. No blood. No notes. Just silence. Cole had read all of it, and he had also read the things that never made the papers. The librarian, a woman named Edith whose voice trembled like a moth's wing, had told him about the dreams. For years after the vanishing, people who lived within a 10-mile radius of the valley reported the same nightmare. They were standing in Whitmore's town square at dusk, and all around them the buildings were full of a gentle, phosphorescent light, and inside every window, shapes moved, not walking, but drifting, like figures underwater. And in the dream, they felt an overwhelming urge to join them, to step through a door that wasn't quite visible, to become part of a congregation that hung just below the threshold of hearing. Several people had woken standing barefoot in their own backyards, facing the direction of the valley. Cole hadn't dreamed it yet, but he had come prepared with a digital recorder, a camera, and a small leather journal in which he intended to document every rational explanation before the irrational one took hold. He started at the diner. The door opened with a shriek of rusted hinges, and the smell inside was a museum of decay, old grease, desiccated coffee grounds, the ghost of bacon fat clinging to the air like a memory. Sunlight fell in dusty columns through grime-coated windows, illuminating the counter where 5 stools stood at irregular angles. A coffee cup sat beside a plate with the fossilized remains of an English muffin, a knife still smeared with butter. Cole crouched to photograph the scene, the shutter click obscenely loud in the dead air. In the kitchen, a pot sat on the cold stove, its bottom scorched where someone had apparently left it to boil dry. He touched the handle, the metal was icy, inert. Nothing here suggested violence, and that was the most disturbing part. The absence of struggle was a kind of violence all its own, a vacuum that the mind couldn't help but fill with horrors. He moved up the street to the Mercantile, a general store whose shelves still held cans of soup and boxes of powdered milk, labels faded to illegibility. The cash register drawer stood open, a few bills still nested in their slots, as if the clerk had been interrupted in the middle of counting change. Behind the counter, a wooden stool lay on its side. On the floor beside it, Cole found the first thing that made his pulse quicken, a pair of glasses, wire-rimmed, the lenses clouded with a fine, gray dust that didn't quite feel like dust. When he picked them up, the dust clung to his fingers with a faint, staticky crackle, and he felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind his eyes, not pain, exactly, but a kind of resonant hum, like a tuning fork struck against the inside of his skull. He dropped the glasses and the sensation stopped instantly. He stared at his hand. The dust was gone, absorbed or evaporated. He made a note in his journal with a slightly shaky pen. Localized auditory phenomenon. Infrasound, he wrote, but he didn't believe it. The schoolhouse sat at the north end of the village, a single-room building with a bell tower that had lost its bell. Inside, the chalkboard still bore a teacher's careful cursive, a lesson on simple fractions, halted mid-equation. A row of small wooden desks faced the board, each one littered with papers and crayons. Cole walked the aisle between them and stopped at the desk closest to the window. A child's drawing lay there, a crayon rendering of a house and a stick figure family. But behind the stick figures, filling the background like a curtain, was a shape made of dense, scribbled black, pressing so hard the crayon had gouged the paper. In the corner of the drawing, in wobbly letters, the child had written, "The quiet man is coming." Cole photographed the drawing, his throat tight. In the schoolhouse, the silence felt different, not empty, but expectant, as if the room were holding its breath. He found the church at the edge of the village, where the forest began to reclaim the land. Whitewashed boards had grayed and warped, and the steeple tilted at an angle that made the whole structure look like a tired old man leaning on a cane. The heavy oak door was ajar, and Cole pushed it open into a sanctuary bathed in a queer, greenish light filtered through stained glass that depicted, not saints, but a scene of harvest, sheaves of wheat, a sickle moon, a ring of figures holding hands. He had seen photographs of the church from before the vanishing, and those windows had shown the ascension of Christ. Someone had changed them. The pews were empty, but at the altar, a single candle burned, a fat pillar of beeswax that had melted down nearly to the wood, its flame steady and unnaturally blue at the core. Cole approached slowly. The air around the candle was cold, not warm, and the flame cast no shadow of him on the wall. He raised his camera, but the screen showed only static, churning gray and black like a television tuned to dead air. He swore under his breath and pulled out the digital recorder instead, pressing record. October 18, 10:47 a.m. I'm inside the Whitmore Church of the Harvest. There's a candle here that shouldn't be burning. The flame is wrong. I'm going to check the vestry. He walked to the door behind the altar and found a small room lined with shelves of hymnals and a desk cluttered with papers. A leather-bound journal lay open, its pages covered in cramped handwriting that grew progressively less legible. The entries belonged to Reverend Silas Hale, and they painted a picture of a community that had unearthed something in the hills. The early pages were mundane, notes on parishioners, prayer requests, a debate about the annual harvest fair. But by late September 1993, the tone shifted. Hale wrote of a sound heard in the woods at night, a low, rhythmic vibration that some of the townspeople called the heartbeat. He described children waking from sleep and walking to the edge of the forest, their eyes open but unseeing, having to be physically carried back to their beds. Then, on October 10, a week before the vanishing, a single, chilling entry, "They came to me tonight, the elders, and told me a story I had hoped was myth. The quiet man, they called it, an intelligence that sleeps beneath the valley, beneath the roots of the oldest hemlock. It dreams of company. It offered them a bargain 100 years ago, when the mines collapsed and the winter was starving them, prosperity, protection, in exchange for a seat at the table. They thought they had paid the debt. They were wrong. The debt is a cycle. The quiet man collects not in coin but in stillness. Tomorrow we will gather in the church. God forgive me, I don't know if I'm meant to stop it or serve it. The entry ended there. Cole flipped the page and found the rest of the journal blank, except for the very last page, which contained only a series of symbols, spirals and sharp angles, drawn so heavily the pen had torn through the paper in several places. He photographed the pages and then stood in the vestry, trying to parse the implications. A bargain. A cycle. If the entire village had gathered in this church on the night of October 16th, then something had happened here that left no bodies because the bodies had become something else. He thought of the dream the librarian described, the figures drifting in phosphorescent light, and a cold dread settled in his stomach. He decided to stay the night. There was a motel on the far side of town, the Whitmore Rest, a single-story row of rooms with doors painted a cheerful turquoise that had chipped into a scabrous gray. He chose room number 4, the one with the least amount of visible mold, and set up his equipment. He had brought a portable battery pack, a lantern, a sleeping bag, and a small camcorder with night vision. As the sun sank behind the ridge and the valley filled with a blue, thickening dusk, he sat on the edge of the bed and listened. The silence that had dominated the daylight hours began to change after dark, not breaking but shifting in frequency, as if a pressure were being slowly released. He heard, or imagined he heard, a sound like the exhalation of a vast, subterranean lung. The air in the room grew heavy, and the temperature dropped sharply enough that his breath misted. He switched on the lantern and the camcorder, pointing the lens out the window toward the main street. Through the viewfinder, the street appeared empty, bathed in the sickly green glow of the camera's night mode. For a long time, nothing moved. Then, at the edge of the frame, near the diner, a shape flickered, a vertical smudge of lighter gray that could have been a trick of condensation. Cole's finger tightened on the focus ring. The smudge resolved, momentarily, into the silhouette of a man standing perfectly still beneath the dead traffic light. The figure had no discernible features, just a human-shaped absence of light, and it faced the motel directly. Cole's heart hammered, but he forced himself to keep watching. The figure didn't walk so much as drift, gliding sideways out of the frame with a fluidity that had nothing to do with human locomotion. He yanked the camcorder from the tripod and ran to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. The street was empty. But the traffic light, which had hung motionless for 3 decades, was now swinging gently back and forth on its wire, as if someone had just brushed past it. He didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the door, the lantern hissing softly, and replayed the footage. The shape was there, a distortion on the tape that couldn't be explained by grain or artifact. When he slowed the playback, he caught something else, audio. The camcorder's microphone had been recording, and beneath the hum of the lantern, he heard a low murmur, barely audible, like a crowd of voices whispering in unison from a great distance. He isolated the clip, amplified it, and felt the blood drain from his face. The whispers were not random. They were repeating a phrase, over and over, a phrase that matched the cadence of the strange symbols in the Reverend's journal, and at the center of the sound, he heard his own name. Not clearly, but unmistakably, Cole, come join. Cole. He tore the headphones off. The rational scaffolding he had built around this investigation collapsed all at once. He told himself it was auditory pareidolia, the brain's desperate attempt to find patterns in noise. But he knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that the village was not empty. It was full to bursting with something that had been waiting, and he had just accepted an invitation he hadn't realized he'd received. He decided to leave immediately, night be damned. He stuffed his gear into his bag, yanked open the motel door, and stepped into a night that felt utterly alien. The stars above were wrong, too bright, too blue, arrayed in constellations he didn't recognize. The forest around the village was no longer just dark, it was a wall of absolute blackness that seemed to have crept closer, erasing the road he had walked in on. He aimed his flashlight down the main street, but the beam died 6 feet in front of him, swallowed by a fog that hadn't been there an hour before. He walked toward where his car should have been, counting steps, and after 300 paces he found himself back at the motel, staring at room number 4. The traffic light swayed mockingly. A child's laughter rang out from the schoolhouse, high and crystalline, achingly innocent, and utterly impossible. Cole turned in a slow circle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In the windows of the diner, a soft, phosphorescent glow began to kindle, the same glow described in the librarian's dream. And inside the glow, shapes moved, dozens of them, drifting in a slow, underwater dance. He could see them now without the camera, the faint outlines of people, tall and short, adults and children, their edges blurred as if they were made of smoke and starlight. They were all facing him. He felt a pull, a magnetic tug deep in his chest, an overwhelming urge to walk toward the diner, to push open the door and step inside and finally understand the silence that had consumed them. His feet moved before he could stop them, and he bit down on his tongue until he tasted copper, using the pain to anchor himself. He fumbled for the digital recorder, pressed record with trembling fingers, and spoke into it, his voice a hoarse whisper. "This is Cole Danvers. If you find this, do not come to Whitmore. There is no crime here, no disaster. It's a transaction. A standing invitation. The village didn't vanish, it graduated. It moved into a different state of being. I think they're still here, all of them, but they're not what they were. And I think I'm next. The quiet man. It doesn't kill you. It just makes you quiet. Please, if you find my car, burn it. Burn everything. Don't listen to the whispers." He set the recorder down on the hood of the blue pickup truck, leaving it running. The phosphorescent light had spread to the mercantile, to the church, to every window along the street, and the whispers were no longer distant, they surrounded him, a gentle, lulling susurrus that promised an end to all striving. He could see, in the deepest part of the glow, a door that wasn't a door, a threshold cut into the air itself, and beyond it, a vast, quiet dark that pulsed like a heartbeat. One of the drifting figures, a small one, child-sized, separated from the diner window and floated toward him, arm extended, its hand dissolving into a swirl of light. Cole's resolve crumbled. He wept, he screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The silence had finally claimed him. He took a step forward, then another, his shadow stretching behind him impossibly long until it detached entirely and stood on its own, a dark sentinel. And then he was among them, his edges softening, his thoughts thinning into a single, peaceful note. The recorder on the truck hood kept rolling, capturing only the sound of soft, rhythmic breathing and, beneath it, a voice that was not his own, repeating the words the child had drawn in crayon, "The quiet man is coming. The quiet man is here." 9 months later, a pair of backcountry hunters stumbled upon the Subaru, half buried in kudzu. They found the recorder, its battery long dead, and the tape inside held no whispers, only static. But one of the hunters, a man named Everett, dreamed that night of a village full of gentle, blue light, and a man with a camera standing in a doorway, smiling with an expression of profound and terrible peace. Everett woke in his own backyard, barefoot, facing the direction of the vanished valley, and knew with an instinctual dread that the village had not finished collecting.